Chapter 17. Porto Velho, Rondônia, Brazil. December. I don't see why we can't just sail down the river to Paraguay, John complained, looking out over the slow green expanse of what would eventually become the Rio Paraguay. We took the river down from Colombia, Dieter replied, and we still ended up walking half the way. The falls and the rapids were not my idea, buddy. Anyway, your friend Sully gave us a plane, John pointed out. We could have flown all the way to Sao Paulo or even Asuncion if we wanted to. But no, that wasn't covert enough. Well, it wasn't, Dieter replied with strained patience. Leaving the plane in Colombia was more convenient for them, and now they won't know which direction we've gone in. I'm surprised that after all these years, you don't think that's a worthwhile objective. Von Rossbach manifested his annoyance by stomping down the street. Locals moved out of his way, giving him uneasy glances. John frowned thoughtfully as he sped up to keep pace. Well, yeah, it is, he conceded. But I really don't think being here is a good idea. And I'd like to go on record as saying that seeing Garmendia is a stupid one. Dieter stopped in his tracks and turned slowly to stare at the youngster. John, I hate it when you beat around the bush like that. Don't hold back. Tell me how you really feel, he said. Chewing on his lip, John put his hands on his hips and glared up at the big man. I'm not taking that back, he said after a long pause. Because I'm right. Every instinct I have tells me that he'll go for us if we show our faces again. Never mind if we come asking for a favor. Do you know anything about this guy? Have you heard some of the stories going around about him? Dieter waved Connor's concerns away. Every gangster who ever lived has stories going around about them. Half of them are made up by the gangster himself. No, they're not, John insisted. I wish to God they were, but they're not, and you've got to know it. This guy's a whack job. You walk in there again, he's going to go off like a bomb. He pointed a finger at him. You know I'm right. You've been in law enforcement how long? Holding out both hands, palms up, Von Rossbach said, If you haven't convinced me by now, you should know you're not going to. You've been whining about this all the way from Bogota. Whining? Not wanting to get myself killed is whining. You know what? I've been around paramilitary, terrorist, and just plain scumbag types all my life. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sure as God made little green apples, that's the kind of thing you old guys say when you want us young guys to go take that hill. Which means I'm onto the joke, Dieter. You want to have a tete-a-tete with Garmendia? You go ahead. I'll send flowers. He moved past Von Rossbach. I'll also find my own way home. Dieter frowned, still a little ticked over that crack about old guys. But when John moved past him and marched down the street, he knew his obligation to Sarah wouldn't allow him to let the boy go, much as he might want to at the moment. John, he said, hurrying down the street after him. "Wait up!" He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Look, we're both dirty and tired and hungry. Let's find a place to clean up and get some rest. Then we'll eat. After that, we'll see what we feel like doing. Okay?" Connor stopped walking and sighed, then turned to Dieter. "Yes to the bath, and the rest, and the food," he said. "But don't expect me to change my mind about Garmendia." He looked at his friend's face and shook his head. "I don't know why you think you have to do it this way. It just doesn't make sense to me. You, of all people, know better." Dieter held up his hand. "Don't. You're just going to start up all over again. So, like I said, let's get clean and fed." Standing back, John said tersely, "Sure, whatever." Von Rossbach moved through the early morning crowd easily. He was simply dressed in a white, short-sleeved shirt, tan slacks, a light-colored straw hat, and sunglasses. As far as possible, his clothing matched that of the local men, with the exception of his well-worn jungle boots. He never wore sandals. They were cooler, granted, but much less stable when the occasion called for action. Despite his bland clothing, the Austrian would never blend in here. He was a head taller than most of the people around him, and his build just didn't fit the local type. They seemed to automatically step aside, as though his blonde height was somehow dangerous. Dieter thought about his last conversation with John, frowning as he walked. The boy had refused to accompany him, excusing himself this morning by saying that he wanted to visit old friends. This was the first time von Rossbach had heard about them, making him wonder if these old friends were in fact mythical. Well, at least they hadn't had another go-around at breakfast about his calling on Garmendia. The boy didn't seem to understand that the smuggler was a resource. And if one had a resource, one used it. Yes, there were other ways of getting home, but all of them were much more trouble than leaning on the local crime lord. In his days with the sector, Dieter had extracted greater favors from people infinitely more dangerous than Lazaro Garmendia. Of course, at the time, he'd had the backup of his sector kill squads, should anything happen to him. But even retired, he still had friends in the sector. True, many of them were looking for him at the moment with the intention of interrogating him to within an inch of his life. At least he didn't think they'd go beyond that last inch. But the protection should still be there. After all, if the sector allowed their retired agents to get killed by the bad guys, morale would suffer. The sector was big on boosting morale. Another thing that John didn't understand was that Garmendia was a type. Push the right buttons and you'd get the same reactions every time. Dieter was confident that he could play the smuggler like a piano. The kid was just being stubborn. Or maybe it was something about his age. Perhaps he was trying to assert himself. Teenagers did that. It could also have something to do with his mother's absence. Dieter considered that for a moment, then mentally swept it aside. Whatever was going on with the boy was ill-timed and damned annoying. John watched von Rossbach go with a disagreeable sense of apprehension. It felt like that excellent Brazilian coffee he'd drunk for breakfast was still perking. Maybe the anxiety was because he didn't know what it was his mother held over the smuggler's head, and he hated not having vital information like that. Or maybe he was just being opinionated. But deep down inside, something was telling him that Dieter was walking into a hornet's nest, head up, shoulders back, brain in neutral. What was up with the big guy these days? They'd gotten through the jungle the first time without a single flare-up. This time, they'd struck sparks off each other from day one. He thought about the last weeks. Had he been more irritable lately, or was it Dieter that was suddenly more irritating? And if so, to either question, why? A sudden picture of Wendy smiling at him and the heady memory of her kisses came to him on a wave of endorphins, and he shook his head, smiling. Yeah, well, there was that. Maybe Dieter was missing Mom too. He looked up and down the street, then started off for Garmendia's Palisade by a different route than Dieter had taken. If he hurried, he should get there before von Rossbach walked into trouble. John figured the secret door he'd used a few months ago was either blocked or watched, or both. Fortunately, there was another way in that he'd discovered, and his mom had perfected. He thought he might still be narrow enough to fit. It only provided a place from which to observe. There was no way into the house from the tunnel, but at least he'd know what was happening to his big friend. Then, maybe, with luck, he'd be able to help. At least that was the plan du jour. It would have been nice if it was dark. To enter the Palisade's grounds, he'd take a short jaunt through the sewer, then come up out of a storm drain. But he'd be exposed in the bright morning light for a few minutes as he worked his way to the house itself. No help for it. That Dieter was an eager beaver and a morning person to boot, which Garmendia probably wasn't. Another reason to not expect a hospitable reception. John also hoped that no security of any type was patrolling the alleys, looking for someone trying to break into the surrounding mansions. The local upper class, those just below the level who could afford their own personal security guards, clubbed together to hire men to scope out the whole neighborhood. The rich really loved it because they benefited without having to spend a cent. Using a crowbar he'd borrowed from the pension, he hoisted the drain cover, slipped under it, and dropped down, allowing the cover to slam down above him. It always cost him a little skin to do it this way, but aside from the sound of the slam, it left no evidence of his passing. He hunkered down to straddle the slimy green trickle down the center of the sewer. It was mostly a storm drain, in fact, and Doc walked in the direction of Garmendia's Palisade, wrinkling his nose a little. The drain cover was just inside the wall of the smuggler's estate, deep in the greenery that made up the garden, and it was a damned tight fit. John had to take off his shirt and rub Vaseline onto the rim to squirm through. Even then, he was bleeding by the time he dragged himself out, grateful for the first time that he was a rangy type and not a mold of muscle like Dieter. He was still getting bigger through the chest and shoulders though, No doubt about that. He had studied the area as closely as he could through the grill of the cover and seen nothing. Upon crawling out of the drain, he'd lain quiet on the moist soil beneath the bougainvillea and frangipani and assorted tropical bushes, looking for booby traps or cameras. He found neither. A crook who isn't paranoid, he thought in wonder. He didn't think he'd ever met one before. He shrugged into his shirt and looked around, listening for any sound of human activity. John was amazed that Garmendia allowed so much cover so close to such an undeniable weak spot in his perimeter. Unless it was a trap of some kind. There was a comforting thought. The garden was weed-free and tidy, but the plants were all old ones, indicating that this was no one's special care. So he could look forward to remaining unobserved by gardeners, at least. He still couldn't get over the absence of any electronic surveillance. That meant the smuggler was relying on his muscle to watch over him. Given that even working together, they didn't seem bright enough to change a light bulb, this must mean they're unbelievably vicious. He groaned internally, cursing Dieter's hubris. Goons like these may be dumb as a box of rocks, but they could be incredibly inventive within their own limited sphere of interest. Deliberately, he pushed his attention to finding a way across the open ground between the green belt around the wall and the green belt around the house. He set off to explore. After about 15 minutes, he found a peninsula of shrubbery that reached towards the house, cutting the empty space between him and it to about 20 feet. John pulled out the ocular he'd brought with him and studied the house. He caught no hint of movement through the broad windows that overlooked his hiding place. Not that that meant anything. If someone was sitting or standing still 10 feet from the windows, he'd be unable to see them. He waited 5 minutes, wishing it could be more, but knowing he had to get into place. Or Dieter might be on his way to the river before he ever left cover. John stood and moved quickly to the protection of the shrubs around the house. He didn't run. That would have attracted attention, even if only from the corner of someone's eye. Once he'd burrowed into the thick growth of the bushes, he moved towards the tunnel entrance. It wasn't really a tunnel. It was more of a ventilation shaft running from the crawl space beneath the building. This area was still on the alluvial plain of the river, and the builders had wanted insurance against floods, as well as some air. At least, that's what his mother had thought. Apparently, it had become a highway for rats and other vermin. As a former owner of the place had sealed the shafts at their point of origin on the foundation of the house. The workmen hadn't done a very good job, and Mom had cleared the bricks from one place, replacing them with a disguised false door. Nothing lethal bit him as he crawled along in utter darkness, which wasn't something you could count on, especially on the borders of Amazonia. A bit of dirt had built up along the bottom edge. He pulled out his pocket knife and cleared it away, then stuck the blade into the crack between the false mortar and the real, and pried on the door. At first, the blade bent perilously, and he didn't think it was going to open. He was about to pull it out when the door began to move. He got his fingernails around the edge and pried until he could get a hand in and drag the little door open. John bent and looked into the dark hole. There was a faint light in the distance, and the shaft was draped with spider webs. He shuddered. It wasn't just that he disliked spiders. Hereabouts, a lot of them were poisonous, and he didn't look forward to the prospect of being bitten again. Biting his lips, he pushed himself forward. At least he would fit. After about 20 feet, though, he began to doubt that. Maybe it's time I put aside childish things, like avoiding dogs and crawling through air ducts. He did fit, but it was a damned tight fit. Getting out of here is going to be a bitch. Garmendia had taken the time to shave and dress before coming down to see his uninvited and most unwelcome guest. The grooming was not to honor the man, but to allow time for his outrage to subside from murderous to merely insulted, which most of the smuggler's acquaintances, whether rivals or employees, would recognize as more than dangerous enough. He'd soothed his anger, not in fear of the sector or its agent, but because he wanted to know just how much von Rossbach knew about his secret, and who, if anyone, he had told. Once he had his answers, well, the sector agent might just become fatally accident-prone. He might fall into a river, for example, at a place where caimans gathered. Garmendia smiled at the image of the crocodile-like reptiles tearing into the foreigner's flesh. It almost put him in a good mood. He found von Rossbach in the morning room, sipping coffee and smoking a huge cigar. Irritation rose in him to find that his servants had provided refreshment without his permission. He'd deal with that later. Dieter looked up to find Garmendia standing in the doorway, his eyes still puffy from sleep, but bright with rage and hatred. Deep inside him, a sense of warning woke, and he admitted to himself that, just perhaps, John might have had a point. The smuggler moved into the room and took a stance before him. "Are you comfortable, Senor von Rossbach?" "Very comfortable, thank you," Dieter said, then took a sip from his cup. "Your cook makes an excellent café comme lait." "I am so glad that you approve," Garmendia growled. He moved closer and clasped his hands behind him, glaring down at the former sector agent. "It was also good of you to see me on short notice," von Rossbach added, smiling falsely. "Oh," said Lazaro in mock surprise. "I actually had a choice then." Dieter took another sip and smiled. "Not really." The smuggler looked around. "And where is your young friend? I would have expected him to be with you." Shaking his head, Dieter said, "Not this time." He put the cup and saucer down on the table beside him. "I find that, once again, we must call upon your assistance." "What kind of assistance?" Dieter began to feel annoyed at the smuggler's persistence in looming over him. "Travel assistance." Why don't you sit down and we can talk? Because, Garmendia said quietly, stepping forward until their legs almost touched. I do not want to sit down, any more than I want to give you assistance, or wanted to see you in the first place. Suddenly he grinned, and there was pure evil in his eyes. But since you have come, I shall do my very best to entertain you. Uh-oh, von Rossbach thought. John had checked the room where he and Dieter had forced Garmendia's cooperation the last time they were here, and had found it empty. He didn't check the kitchen, easily found by the scent of coffee and cooking, since he was certain that von Rossbach wouldn't be there. He wished he had a floor plan of the place. They're probably in a parlor or maybe some sort of breakfast room, he thought. The place, a former rubber baron's mansion, was big enough to have both. Red rubber had been very profitable back around the turn of the century, what with thousands of Indio debt slaves who could be worked to death collecting latex in the jungle. He headed back towards the kitchen, figuring that if he had a breakfast room, he'd put it where the coffee and toast wouldn't get cold on the way to the table. As he moved slowly and carefully along, he thought he heard the rumble of Dieter's voice. Good call, Connor. He pulled himself through the duct until he was under the room from which von Rossbach's voice had come. John found himself at a bad angle for observation and had to content himself with listening. The conversation was not going Dieter's way. You force yourself into my house, Garmendia was saying, walking around his unwanted guest. You give orders to my servants. You make yourself very comfortable. And then... He came back to face von Rossbach, holding up one finger. You tell me that I must do you a favor. He smiled and tilted his head. You are a very pushy man, senor. Dieter took a puff of his cigar and narrowed his eyes, savoring the rich Havana smoke that went so well with good mountain coffee. He'd feel even better if he were armed, but that would have been stupid. Garmendia's men were professionals, if not what you'd call top drawer. You will not be sorry to do me a favor, old friend, he said. You would only be sorry not to. The smuggler lost it then. He grabbed the silver coffee pot and swung it at Dieter. The big man's hand slashed up and knocked it out of his hand, splashing the smuggler with the hot liquid. Garmendia shrieked, more rage than pain. Doors flew open along the wall that faced the veranda. They were made of slatted louvers anyway, no barrier to sound. Shit, Dieter thought. Garmendia tried to grab him around the shoulders. Dieter shoved the cigar over his shoulder, and the smuggler toppled backward with a yell of fear as it nearly touched his eye. That gave Dieter enough time to grab two of the first wave of Garmendia's men and to smash their heads together with a ringing knock that made every man in the room wince. Every man but the one behind him. Dieter's eyes widened slightly as he threw a punch into the man's stomach with all his huge strength behind it. The fist sank through a layer of blubber and rebounded off muscle like... No, not rubber. Like a rubber tree. The thug was a good 6 inches taller than Dieter, with a shelf-browed, huge-nosed face, a hormone-diseased giant. He was built like a pear, but most of the bulk was anything but fat. A hand like the Jolly Green Giant's fly swatter came around and hit the Austrian over one ear. The room dimmed, and Dieter felt his knees begin to buckle. He had them back in working order in an instant, just in time for the next 6 of Garmendia's goons to pile on. Garmendia spat into Dieter's battered face, then swung at him with all his strength. His fist hit squarely on the big man's jaw, and von Rossbach's eyes rolled back, his head lolling. The bodyguards let go of his arms, and the Austrian fell, unconscious, to the floor. Swearing mightily, Garmendia rubbed his fist, then shook it. He turned to Dieter and gave him a vicious kick in the stomach. "Bastardo!" he shouted, and kicked him again, almost knocking himself off balance. "You are going to die!" A guard took out his pistol and pulled back the slide. "No!" Garmendia said, slapping the gun aside. "Idiota! Too easy, too quick, and not here." He glared at the unconscious man, chewing his lip thoughtfully. "We'll take him to the river," he chuckled. "Something there is probably hungry, no?" His men smiled. "Piranha?" one asked. "No, no," Garmendia said, waving the suggestion away. "Too hard to find. Cayman will do." His eyes glittered at the thought of the big lizards. "And they take bigger bites." They all laughed. "But first, I shall have my breakfast like a civilized man. Lock him in the trunk of the car." The smuggler turned away, then back again. "And park the car in the sun." His men laughed again and began dragging Dieter away. Whoops, John thought. Looks like we're going on a boat trip. He began to back out and found himself having to work very hard at it. The going had been tight heading in, but pushing himself backward seemed to make him fatter somehow. In less than a minute, he had himself plugged in the duck. His shirt had rolled up around his shoulders, and he couldn't push it down or pull it off. The excess bulk had been jammed in like a stopper in a bottle. Great, he thought. Just great. Then he forced himself to calm down and consider the problem as though it were outside himself. He pulled himself forward again, and eventually the shirt began to roll back down. When he'd loosened it sufficiently, he pulled it up over his head, the sort of exercise that made him wish he was double-jointed. Then he resumed his backward journey, dragging the shirt with him. Thank God my pants aren't the problem. After about 30 minutes of sweaty, claustrophobic effort, John finally crawled backward out of the hole in the palisade's wall. For a moment, he just lay there, indulging a sense of relief and release as the hot, humid, muggy, wonderful outside air cooled him. Then he forced himself to his feet and began looking for a limo left in the sun. John found the car with little problem. Unfortunately, there was a veritable crowd of thugs around it. One sat on the trunk with his feet on the back bumper, while two of his friends leaned against it, laughing at his jokes. One of them was big enough to make John blink, wondering if he was an optical illusion. They all had slight, suspicious bulges under loose Guyabera shirts. John considered a couple of ideas about creating a distraction, then rejected them. There were two more under a nearby tree. These five were the only ones visible from where he crouched in the bushes, but he was willing to bet that there were more nearby. Plus, there were passerbys, some of whom might call the police, and many of the local police were friends of Garmendia's. Good friends, affluent friends. It would have to be one hell of a distraction, he thought. Like maybe holding a gun to Garmendia's head. If he had a gun, which he didn't. The point became moot as the smuggler came out and signaled that he wanted them to start up the car. Guess Lazaro changed his mind about eating breakfast. Or he's on a diet. He eyed the sweaty jowls, already blue with beard stubble. Nah, probably just in a hurry. Unless he'd been in that damned tunnel even longer than he'd thought. His best bet now was to try to follow them, or failing that, to get to the river and hope to catch up with them there. John sprinted for the wall, hoping that most of the goons were fighting for a place in the limo and so wouldn't notice him. He felt a cold stab of anxiety. This was not going well. Why couldn't Dieter listen to him for a change? Using the branches of a bush that had begun to turn to a tree, Connor was able to get high enough to stretch his hands onto the top of the wall. Then he pulled himself over and dropped down on the other side. His heart almost stopped when the limo drove right by him. Miraculously, he went unnoticed. Garmendia must have been very distracted by his plans for von Rossbach. His bodyguards probably wouldn't have noticed who John was, but only that he was unarmed. John stood and watched them go, then started to jog down the street, planning the quickest way to the river. As he ran, he noticed a woman on a moped speeding towards him, and decided that she was about to find herself on foot. The woman wasn't young, but she didn't seem elderly either. She wore a pale blue shirt and a beige skirt, and a big straw hat tied to her head with a gauzy scarf. Huge sunglasses made her look like a bug. John dashed in front of her, and the woman brought the bike to a skidding stop. "I'm sorry, Senora," Connor started to say, reaching out for her. "John?" she said, whipping off her sunglasses. "I've been looking all over." "Mom?" The relief he felt almost made him weak in the knees. "No time," he said brusquely, and got behind her on the moped. "Dieter's in trouble. Follow that car." Sarah rolled her eyes. "And here I'd hoped there'd come a day when I neither heard nor used that phrase ever again," she said as she revved up the little machine and started down the road. "So what's your story?" she asked, pleased by the feel of his arms around her. She'd missed him so much. "Dieter went to Garmendia to get help in getting back to Paraguay," John explained. Sarah frowned. "He went to Garmendia for something like that?" That was like using an axe to swat a fly. John shrugged. "He thinks of Lazaro as a smuggler and doesn't seem to think he's dangerous. Anyway, uh-oh," Sarah thought. When John's voice petered out like that, he was usually going to say something she didn't like. "What?" she demanded. He pursed his lips for a moment, then plunged ahead. "Garmendia thinks that you've told us some big dark secret of his. So he cooperated with us the first time we came through here, and we asked for his help." "Shit," Sarah muttered. "That was an incredibly stupid thing to do, John." But this time, he took exception. John winced. That was putting it mildly, considering that Garmendia was going to throw Dieter to the crocodiles. Shaking her head, Sarah said, "If you only knew. I'm surprised you lived long enough for there to be a this time." Up ahead, she caught sight of the big limo. She took stock of what they knew. "Well, we know who's in the car. We know where they're going and why. Now, what do we do about it?" "Mom, are you carrying?" "Don't you know me any better than that?" she asked. "Check the side saddle." John opened one of the straw baskets attached to the side of the bike. There, wrapped in a red and white checked napkin, he found a micro Uzi and 3 spare magazines, plus a stun grenade. "What about you?" he asked, flicking the napkin back over the gun. "I'm covered," she said grimly. They rode on in silence for a while as they'd come to a more populated area and the traffic was thick and deadly. You got a license here by paying the Jefe a small bribe, if you bothered to get a license at all. Fortunately, the limo had to slow down just as much, if not more, than their little moped. There were trucks, gaudily painted, and often crammed with crates of poultry. Once, Sarah had to stop, lest she risk coming up right behind them. "Mom," John suddenly said, "I've been thinking, and we need to stop them before they get to Garmendia's yacht." Sarah said nothing as she concentrated on the traffic, but turned her head slightly to show she was listening. "If we could take out a tire, they'd have to stop." "Yes," she agreed, "but we'd still be 5-2 with Dieter in their hands." John blew out his breath. "Yeah, anyway, your micro Uzi wouldn't do it." Sarah was silent a little longer. Then John felt her relax. "It's not the best idea in the world," she said, "but it's the best we've got. Look in my other saddlebag." Leaning back, John rummaged in the basket for a moment. Cool, he said. One of those collapsible shotguns. He hugged her one-armed as he examined it. I might have known you'd have one of these. And explosive shells? Neat. Sarah smiled. Yeah, I'm always on the lookout for something practical that will fit in my purse. She sped up as they came into the riverside area of town, deserted this time of year, drawing even with the limo's back end. Sarah felt like she'd had a target painted on her chest, even though the limo's blacked out windows made it impossible to tell if they'd even spotted her yet. She felt John adjusting his weight as he prepared to bring the shotgun up from the side, away from the limo. Suddenly, the huge black car sped up. "They've seen us," she muttered. "Come on, Mom, we're losing them," John said. Sarah gunned the throttle. Unfortunately, that didn't mean much on a moped. "Mom! This is our top speed, John. We're on a moped, for God's sake, not a chopped Harley." He let out an impatient breath. "Gee, this situation seems weirdly familiar." "No, that would be them trying to run us down while we're in a vehicle that seems to be standing still." She grimaced. Her life was probably going out of control again if she was measuring positive and negative by such bizarre standards. John kept his gaze focused on the limo as though he could slow it by sheer will. Up ahead, the road curved sharply and the limo slowed. Sarah maintained her speed, leaning into the curve like a racer, and they quickly gained back lost ground. Buildings reared on either side, huge, decrepit warehouses, from the rubber boom, or perhaps one of the 70s mega projects gone bust. "Go, go, go," John urged, barely above a whisper. He automatically shifted his weight to balance his mother's, and his eyes sought out the target. "Now, John," his mother said. "This is as good as it's gonna get." He brought up the shotgun, aimed, and fired. A brief spurt of fire from the dusty, potholed street. A miss. The limo slammed on the brakes, fishtailing slightly, and the moped shot ahead of them, turning down an alley. "Mom!" John shouted in protest. "What the hell are you doing?" Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy trying to get them away from potential disaster. "What was I thinking?" She berated herself. "This is John I've got riding behind me." Riding behind her and pitting a shotgun against a carload of demented goons. Nothing was more important than John. Nothing. Not even Dieter von Rossbach, who should have known better than to pit himself against a Rottweiler like Garmendia. Especially armed with nothing better than a secret he didn't even know. How could she forget that for even a second? "Mom," John said, leaning close. "You remember how a minute ago we were talking about them chasing us? Well, they're doing it." Shit, she thought. Up ahead, there was a burst of debris from a wall. "And they're firing at us," John added. "No kidding." "They've got automatic weapons," he went on, as some things went whack, whack, whack. Through the air, far too close. She began to sway the moped back and forth. That's not going to help for long, she thought. The limo was already gaining. John risked a glance behind them. There were gunmen leaning out of the car windows, all of them firing. "Mom!" he said, his voice quavering a little. Bullets whizzed by, spanging up dirt and bits of building around them. Sarah saw a dark space up ahead that warned of an alley between the tightly packed buildings, and she turned into it. Unfortunately, it was wide enough for the limo, and she knew they'd follow. It wound on, and she looked desperately for side alleys, finding none as they came around a curve only to find a dead end. The moped fishtailed and almost went over, but she managed to bring it to a skidding halt, sideways to the main road. The limo came on, and Sarah gasped in horror. The gunmen, intent now on capturing their targets, ceased firing, but leaned farther out, shouting insults and threats. They came on fast, and Sarah wondered if the goons intended to smash them into a wall. "John!" she said, and hopped off the moped, readying herself to jump onto the limo's hood. In a second, her son stood beside her. The alley narrowed almost imperceptibly just beyond the deceiving curve. Before the driver could stop, the momentum of the car forced it tightly into the alley. The gunman disappeared, and the glossy sides of the vehicle screeched as they were crushed against the stone walls of the surrounding houses. "Whoa," John said, wincing. "That's gotta hurt." Blowing out her breath, Sarah let her head hang for a moment. Then there was a tapping sound from the limo. They, whoever had survived, were trying to break through the windshield. "Thank God for bulletproof, shatterproof glass," she thought. "Come on," she said to her son. "Let's get out of here before they manage to break out." John snorted in amusement and took hold of the bike. Together, they lifted it up onto the hood and rolled it onto the roof. Within the car, they could hear them screaming and pounding on the windshield and roof. When John and Sarah stepped up onto the roof, shots rang out, followed by screams and curses as the bullets ricocheted around inside the armored interior. "It's like they're the Keystone Cops," Sarah thought, shaking her head in disbelief. "I know Garmendia's men aren't the brightest tools in the shed, but John knew better than that when he was 7. They got down off the back as silence fell within the limo. Sarah glanced at the blank glass and opened her belt pouch. She pulled out a set of lockpicks and got to work on the trunk lock. There was a sudden series of blows on the back windshield. "I'd just like to remind you, Lazaro," Sarah said, her voice mild in spite of her having to speak loudly enough to be heard in the back seat, that glass is the only thing between you and me." She looked up at the window. "And you've been shooting at my son." There was silence for a moment, then the dim imprint of a face as Garmendia got as close as he could to the rear windshield. "You lied to me, Connor! Your brat there, he threatened to tell." "I haven't broken my word," Sarah said, her voice hard. "The kid was bluffing, Lazaro. I swore that I would never tell, and I never will. Not even to him. Her eyes narrowed. I don't give my word often, Garmendia, and I don't break it when I do. But I will break you if you don't back down. The smuggler's face disappeared from the window, and there was silence in the limo. Sarah went back to work on the lock. In less than 30 seconds, she had it open. You're out of practice, Mom, John said as the lid came up. Everybody's a critic, Sarah groused. Then she sucked in her breath through her teeth at the sight of von Rossbach. She said. The big man lay on his side, his hands tied behind his back, his blonde hair soaked in blood, as was the side of his face, and his nose and eye had begun to swell. I could sure use a drink, Sarah suddenly thought. A chaotic snarl of emotion was erupting within her, horror at her friend's condition mixed with compassion, as well as rage at Garmendia for doing this to him. Not to mention the stiff anger she felt towards Dieter for being so foolish, and John for risking himself and herself for risking John. It was almost overwhelming. She licked her lips. A nice drink would sure do no good whatsoever. A smoke would be nice too, but that wouldn't help either. She took a deep breath and pushed the insidious cravings aside. You awake? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Barely, he said. Dieter turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were mere slits in the bruised flesh. He tried to smile. Oh, Dieter, she said, her heart sinking. Reaching in, she checked his bonds. John tapped her on the shoulder, flicking his right hand to set the blade of his balisong. She took the wickedly sharp little knife and cut the sisal twine, unwound the ropes from where they were digging into his wrists. Shaking her head, she stood back to look at him. Come on, she said. Let's get you out of there. You sound like a nurse, he quipped. Sarah didn't answer, but held on to his shoulder to keep him from falling over. John hastened to lend a hand, supporting him from the other side. Glancing at the moped, John said, Mom, we can't get away on that. We'll look like a team of Chinese acrobats. Putting a hand to her forehead, Sarah tightened her lips as she thought. You have a place to stay? She asked quietly. John nodded. Okay, she said. Go steal a car. I'll follow you back on the moped. Once we've got him inside, you can return it to the same neighborhood. Without another word, John jogged off. You've got him well trained, Dieter said, impressed, as always, at the way John and his mother worked together. Shut up, she said offhandedly. Then she frowned at him. You can lie down until he gets back. I don't think so, if you don't mind, the Austrian said. He gripped the edge of the trunk and began to climb out. Sarah steadied him. Is there a point to this? Yeah. Dieter worked his sore jaw. I'm afraid I'll go unconscious again. He sat on the back bumper. Connor! Garmendia shouted from within the limo. Actually, she was surprised he'd been this patient. Yeah, she answered. Get me out of here! Given the company he was keeping, she could well understand his desperation. Hang on, she called back. Don't worry, she said to Dieter. I have no intention of doing anything until you two are well out of here. Even then, I might only give him advice. She smiled slightly and shook her head. You're an idiot, you know that? John advised me against it, he admitted. I figured that, she said. He frowned slightly, then winced as the movement hurt. How did you know? You were alone in the trunk, she said. John and Dieter had been gone about 10 minutes, and it had taken both of them to walk him back down the alley to the car that John had boosted. Sarah shook her head as she remembered how weak he'd been. Ideally, they'd be out of town before Garmendia made it out of this alley, but von Rossbach's condition made that chancy. She let out a deep breath and slammed the trunk lid. Okay, she said. What have you been doing in there? Smothering and waiting for you to get us out, Garmendia snapped. Sarah grinned. Well, I guess I could shoot a few holes in the windows and then you can kick it out. But if I were you, I wouldn't be too comfortable with that idea. What do you suggest, Senora? Lazaro sneered. Haven't you got a cell phone? Why don't you just call your garage? She said. You're going to need a tow anyway. I'm not your mommy, Lazaro. This isn't up to me. You wouldn't be in this fix in the first place if you weren't doing something so damned stupid. Not to mention if I hadn't been doing something so damned stupid. She'd been a lot more focused when she was crazy. Now that I know they're still out there, maybe I should let myself go crazy again. Lazaro banged on the glass. Speaking of crazy, I don't have my phone with me. Sarah rolled her eyes. Okay, she said. Who do you want me to call? "24 hours later, they were on the road to Asuncion in an old wreck of a car that she had gotten by calling in an old debt. Garmendia had agreed to leave them alone on the condition that they left town immediately and never contacted him again. This came about because Lazaro was totally thrown by the new, sane Sarah. Enjoy it while you can, Sarah thought at him. Who knows how long it will last? Mom, John said. Are you all right? She put a hand on her hip, feeling the lumpy crumpled bulk of the bandage under the cloth. The wound wasn't bleeding much, but it needed a doctor to take out the slug, and there hadn't been time. I've been better, but I'll heal. Another of my patchwork of scars. She went on, smiling at Dieter's lumpy, bruised face. It was going to turn every color of the rainbow soon. I shouldn't have left you with Garmendia, he fretted. It wasn't him. It was the bodyguard. The freak, she repeated patiently. And Garmendia shot him right afterward. If you'd been there, you might have caught this. And between your eyes, probably. Garmendia shot him? Dieter asked. The one who looked like a giant Neanderthal in a Gaiabera. In the back, Sarah said. Dieter touched the side of his face, wincing. It's an unfamiliar sensation. A bruise? No, feeling envious of Garmendia, the Austrian said. I wanted to be the one who shot that guy. Very much.